Hello. Thank you for joining us today for the AWWA webinar on Shifting PFAS Treatment Costs, Make Polluters Pay. I'm Corinne Bertoya, Associate Engineer here at the American Water Works Association. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Here are some tips to enhance your webinar experience. We recommend that you close email, instant messengers, and any other programs not currently in use, as they may interfere with the smooth reception of the webinar, causing slide buffering and poor sound quality. Technical assistance can be found at the GoToWebinar technical support page at the link listed in your handouts and on the slide shown. As soon as you close the GoToWebinar screen to leave the webinar, a window will open with the survey questionnaire. We ask that all of you take a few minutes to answer the survey questions. Your feedback is important to us and helps us improve webinar programming. We encourage group participants to pick one person to enter collective responses to the survey and submit them to us. Before we hear from our speakers, I need to inform you that the mention of specific products or services in this webinar does not represent AWWA endorsement. AWWA does not endorse or approve products or services. I am pleased to introduce our distinguished panel of experts for today's program, Margie Gray and Richard Head. PFAS have been discovered in drinking water supplies throughout the country. In response to the growing awareness of this contamination and the public outcry over health effects associated with PFAS, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency issued a lifetime health advisory guideline for PFOA and PFAS, but has otherwise largely left it to the states to issue regulations. The contamination of public drinking water supplies with PFAS has resulted in legal actions against the manufacturers of PFAS or PFAS-containing products to recover the costs of cleanup and/or treatment. Our panel will be happy to answer your questions. Feel free to submit questions at any time throughout this broadcast by using the question pane at the lower right of your screen. Please include your name and the name of the panelist to whom your question should be directed. Let's begin. Margie Gray is a Senior Associate and Principal Engineer for Mott MacDonald. Margie will be covering PFAS Technical and Regulatory Overview. Take it away, Margie.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're gonna start off this hour with an overview of PFAS, talk about what are they, why do we care about these chemicals? And then I'm gonna focus on drinking water with a brief regulatory overview, both of what the US EPA has done versus what some states are doing. And then I'm gonna dive into a little more depth regarding the New Jersey experience. New Jersey is the first state to enact a PFAS MCL and also happens to be where I reside and work. And then I'll talk briefly about what the current most practical treatment options are available to reduce PFAS in drinking water and some things to consider when selecting a treatment solution. So PFAS are perfluoro and polyfluoroalkyl substances that are part of, this is a large group of man-made chemicals that have been used in industry and consumer products since the 1940s. There are thousands of them. But the two most common, familiar to us are PFOA and PFOS, as these have been the most widely detected, and they're also the most studied. And these PFAS chemicals have been used in many products like firefighting foams, food packaging, nonstick cookware, stain and water resistant fabrics, paints and sealants, cleaning products, personal care products. Essentially, they've been found in just a wide variety of everyday products at this point. And these chemicals are characterized by a carbon and fluorine bond that are very, very strong. And many of these PFAS compounds, therefore, don't break down in the environment. And I'm sure you've sometimes heard them called the forever chemicals. So due to their widespread use and the fact that they are very difficult to break down, they are widespread and persistent in the environment. They're found in groundwater, surface waters, soils. They bioaccumulate not only in our bodies, but also in fish and wildlife and livestock. And an important exposure route is believed to be drinking water. And while studies are still going on to get a better understanding of the health effects for humans for each of the individual PFAS compounds, It is believed that the potential health impacts can include childhood and fetal development, hormones, fertility in women, immune system responses, possibly increases in risk of cancer. So in the early 2000s, the PFAS became contaminants of emerging concern. And there were initiatives related to trying to phase out some of the most common ones like PFOS and PFOA, because there were concerns that these were negatively impacting the health of people. And in 2009, the US EPA issued a short-term provisional health advisory on the order of hundreds of nanograms per liter for PFOA and PFOS. And then in the lead up to the third unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, these two compounds were included on contaminant candidate lists. And through the third unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, or UCMR3, over 3 years, public water supplies across the country were tested for 6 different PFAS compounds. And that gave the EPA a better understanding of how widespread and where the particular problem areas were for these PFAS compounds. Unfortunately, the minimum reporting levels used at that time probably masked some of the contaminant levels in some areas because they were relatively high. We can detect to much lower levels these days. But following that UCMR3 cycle, lifetime health advisories were issued by the EPA for PFOA and PFOS at 70 nanograms per liter combined. And these levels were established based on the EPA's assessment of the latest peer-reviewed science with the intent to provide drinking water system operators and relevant government officials with information so that they could take action to protect the public. But these levels are advisories that doesn't have any legally enforceable federal standard, and they're subject to new change as new information becomes available. So this created some confusion and concern as to what potentially impacted water systems were supposed to do. Were they supposed to shut down? And there was a lot of pressure from the public and the media, and also states having concerns that, these are a health-based problem, that these levels that were being proposed were actually not stringent enough. And because these health advisories, as was said in the intro, really didn't have any regulatory impact, states have been left basically on their own and have taken the lead in terms of determining what the true health-based levels that they feel are appropriate. So the EPA got a lot of feedback on those lifetime health advisories, and earlier this year they issued a PFAS action plan where they made a commitment to propose a national drinking water regulatory determination for PFOA and PFOS, and also to add a number of PFAS compounds to the next unregulated contaminant monitoring rules so that we'll get a better understanding of how widespread these contaminants are now that they can detect them to lower levels. So as I said, a number of states have moved forward with looking at additional, a more conservative look at PFAS contaminant levels, and there are about 10 states here that have proposed or have enacted health-based advisory levels that are more stringent or take into effect other PFAS compounds than what the health advisory levels that the EPA issued were. And as you can see, they're doing all kinds of different things. There are no 2 states that have done the same thing. They're all looking at the health-based information, and they're coming up with different interpretations based on what they consider to be the risks of exposure. So this is creating another layer of confusion as states adjacent to each other may be taking very different approaches. New Jersey is one of those states that has moved ahead with maximum contaminant level development. We are the first state to have enacted PFAS MCL, and that was for PFNA, and that was enacted in September 2018. And in New Jersey, the maximum contaminant level development is conducted by our Drinking Water Quality Institute that is was created by our Safe Drinking Water Act. And this body looks at, for any particular contaminant that's under consideration, looks at what the health-based maximum contaminant level is, and then looks at practical things like, well, can you actually analyze it to those levels? Can you actually reasonably provide treatment to get the contaminants reduced to those levels? So when they reviewed the PFAS compounds, PFNA, which has already been enacted, and now we have 2 proposed MCLs for PFOA and PFOS that are likely to be enacted early next year, they came up with the contaminant levels on the right side of the screen. So now we're moving out of a advisory type environment to having enforceable maximum contaminant levels that have teeth, where public water utilities, they can get violations for their sources if they exceed the contaminant levels. So as the PFNA MCL is being phased in New Jersey, and with the PFOA and PFOS on the horizon, we have a lot of water utilities are being proactive in conducting sampling to determine whether or not they are impacted, and those that will be impacted are beginning to plan, and they're trying to figure out what are their best options for dealing with the contamination. Do they provide treatment for the sources? Do they have a diverse enough portfolio of water sources that they can maybe turn off or shut down certain sources that are impacted and rely on others that are less impacted? Perhaps if you don't have that option, maybe there's an adjacent water utility that you could purchase water from that's less impacted. Potentially as a stopgap measure, maybe looking at blending some existing sources, or as a longer-term solution, maybe looking at developing alternate sources. There are a number of things that could be considered. And because these MCLs are going to be phased in rather quickly, particularly the PFOA and PFOS, if you're not impacted utility, you want to be in planning mode right now, and to be able to look at options holistically to determine what options will be the most effective for you, your water source, and best use your resources. So I'm going to talk a little bit about different treatment technologies. The 3 main ones that are available, that are viable, are activated carbon. Could be granular activated carbon or powdered activated carbon, with powdered activated carbon being more of a surface water tool. Anion exchange resins are a newer technology, and then there's reverse osmosis and nanofiltration is also a 3rd option that's a potential solution. Now, I'm not going to spend time talking about reverse osmosis and nanofiltration. I think that's a fairly complex solution where activated carbon and anion exchange are usually a good or reasonable choice for most applications. You start getting into reverse osmosis and nanofiltration, that's a more complicated solution, and probably are less likely to look at that unless you have something else going on that you need to address at the same time as PFAS. So I'm going to focus the rest of the discussion about treatment on GAC and anion exchange in particular, kind of looking at more at the groundwater supply treatment installations, because that's primarily where people are going to have to provide treatment. So on the slide, just kind of taking a look side by side with these 2 types of media. Start on the left with the granular activated carbon. For granular activated carbon, there are many full-scale drinking water installations. This is a well understood treatment solution for PFAS, and regulators are comfortable with it. GAC has good PFAS removal capacity, particularly for the higher chain PFAS like PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, exactly what we're looking to regulate here in New Jersey in the near term. And they also have broader ability to remove other things like organics and other co-contaminants. So that's potentially has additional benefits if you need that at your particular water source. Now, from a sustainability perspective, GAC can be reactivated often. So that's potential benefit, not generating as much waste. On the other hand, sometimes background water quality really doesn't allow you to regenerate your GAC, so your other option is incineration. The goal is to destroy the PFAS so that you're removing it completely from the environment. You wouldn't want to send it to a landfill because that just potentially leaves the problem, kicks it down the road in the future. Now, GAC is a lower cost of these two media, but more media quantity is required to achieve the same amount of treatment. And GAC its performance is going to be based on your contaminant levels as well as other background water quality impacts like total dissolved solids and hardness. If you get water quality information and provide it to your potential media supplier, let them take a look at it and they can let you know kind of what issues there may or may not be as relates to your water. So moving on to the ion exchange side on the right here, ion exchange is a newer technology with limited full-scale installations. So from a regulatory perspective, you may be required to provide more proof of performance, which could be achieved through pilot testing, or possibly regulators might accept evidence of performance on similar waters at other locations. But the reason this newer technology is of interest is that it has very high PFAS removal capacity for unit volume. So it's designed to be very PFAS selective. So and it works well not only on the higher longer chain PFAS, but also shorter chain PFAS. Now, we're not currently regulating for the shorter chain PFAS, but maybe that is on the horizon at some point. So if you know that you have the shorter chain PFAS in your water, then maybe this is something you want to look more closely at. But it does have limited co-contaminant removal. It doesn't have that broad removal ability that GAC has. Resins are single use, so you're looking at incineration. There's no opportunity on drinking water resins for regeneration at this time. And as I said, the cost comparison to GAC resin is much more expensive, but in this case, less media is required. So when you start looking at how it's going to perform, the impacts of background water quality, they tend to be competitive in a lot of situations in terms of technologies that might work at your site. So in terms of implementation, treatment technologies are actually very similar and conceptually. Both GAC and ion exchange, you're looking at a lead lag vessel configuration and what may have multiple trains of lead lag vessels. And your design criteria for a lot of typical applications for GAC will be to provide 20 minutes of total empty bed contact time, and that directly relates to the volume of media that you need. And ion exchange, on the other hand, is 5 minutes total empty bed contact time would be kind of a minimum. So you see, as it relates to volume, that's about 4 times as much volume, a quantity of media that you would need for GAC to achieve similar treatment performance. The nuance on the ion exchange is that you need additional pre-filtration to protect the resin from having solids build up. So other comparisons between the two medias that you might take into consideration is you'll have higher head loss across ion exchange systems, maybe 5 to 10 psi more. They tend to have higher loading rates. With a pre-filter, you'll have additional head loss again on top of that. So you're probably looking at more energy use for ion exchange. So if you're looking at O&M costs, you'd want to make sure you take that into consideration. Both systems are going to need some initial backwashing and rinsing to get the initial water quality to the point where it's acceptable to put into the distribution system. The volumes will vary and the water quality issues will differ between the two media. When it comes to GAC, if you're using bituminous GAC, you'll want to look out for arsenic potentially being just briefly in your effluent water quality. And you'll want to be careful of elevated pH, because the last thing you want to do is have unintended consequences by putting some unusual water quality into your distribution system. But it's just a matter of taking the time to do proper rinsing. So when it comes to backwashing and waste handling, generally your instantaneous requirements for water are a lot higher for GAC, so that may need to be worked out in terms of your distribution system, whether you can handle those flows. And ion exchange generally has lower flow requirements, and waste handling infrastructure overall is probably similar capacity is fine to GAC. Looking at a cost comparison, if we look at GAC, the cost is for virgin carbon maybe about $1.50 to $2 per pound, which is about $50 to $60 per cubic foot. And if we compare that to resin costs, resin's about 5 or 6 times as much as the GAC. But as I said, you don't have to use as much of the resin. So this all equates in terms of overall equipment. On the ion exchange side, your equipment is a lot smaller, takes up a smaller footprint. If you want to design a superstructure and facility, it's a smaller building than the GAC side. So these are all economics comparisons that as you're looking through your treatment options, you can make decisions about, do you need superstructures? Do you want permanent waste handling facilities? And you'll come up in your planning study with some numbers to give you a better understanding of how much it's going to cost overall. And then you can start looking at some other factors that might impact which you select. So I'm going to touch on just a couple of things here about treatment selection to think about. And just going back to that, taking a holistic approach to treatment of PFAS is taking into consideration things like co-contaminants that may be present at your site or potential future regulations. And so along those lines, I'm thinking like if you have VOCs at your site, they're at moderate levels, maybe you want to use granular activated carbon to treat them, both VOCs and your PFAS. Or if they're higher, maybe you want to use ion exchange resin because the VOCs will not impact the ion exchange resin very much. So they're just things that can go into your thought process as you're making decisions, looking at integration into your facility, any site constraints that may be of concern. If you don't have a lot of space, then maybe the smaller footprint of ion exchange is a good solution for you. But ultimately, if you're looking to make a decision between GAC and ion exchange, if you have the ability to pilot test your water supply, that's going to give you the best information you need to get a good understanding of what your O&M costs are going to be for each type of media, because you'll be able to get an estimate of how frequently you're going to have to change the media out. And you may be able to see if there are any other performance issues that are of concern. So just touching on a few things there. And I guess the final thing I'll bring up is anytime you're going through changing treatment or adding a new type of treatment, you just want to be mindful of simultaneous compliance issues that may impact your decisions or just how you handle some of your rinsing, as I mentioned earlier about water quality initially coming off of these media. So a number of things to think about, but ultimately just a few takeaways. Yes, it's very challenging right now for utilities as these treatment requirements are being enacted in various states, and these treatment requirements, they may change depending on what the federal, the EPA does, or perhaps additional PFAS contaminants are going to be added in the future. And if you're potentially impacted by these contaminants, it'd be good to just begin the planning process and make sure you understand what your best options are to address the PFAS contamination. And when you get into selecting the PFAS treatment, make sure you're taking a holistic approach and you're considering other impacts at the site and other contaminants that maybe now's the time to plan to include in the planning for your PFAS treatment, so they can make sure that you're using good use and the most effective use of your resources. And with that, I will pass this off to Richard.
Excellent. Thank you, Margie. Let me put my screen up. And so thank you very much, Margie. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. I'm going to switch a little bit from where Margie was with a description of sort of how we got here and what we can do going forward from a technical point of view to a legal description of how we got here and what are some of the legal remedies that may be available to water systems and municipalities to pay for the treatment technologies that Margie was just describing. Our law firm represents only water systems, municipalities, and states with this type of contamination issue that we've been talking about with PFAS. And unfortunately, what we're seeing with PFAS is following a similar pattern to what we've seen with some other contaminants. So we have some experience that we may be able to fall back on to help with some of these costs that water systems and municipalities are incurring. So I will start with some learning objectives about what we're going to be talking about in this segment of our webinar. Sort of why is PFAS a problem, again, from a legal perspective, and how the scope of the problem was discovered, how is it being regulated across the country, and how litigation may be available to pay for some of those treatment costs. One of the places to start when we're talking about PFAS is a federal law called the Toxic Substances Control Act, which people refer to as TSCA. And TSCA's main objective is to regulate chemicals that pose an unreasonable risk to health or the environment. And they're supposed to be captured before they enter the stream of commerce. So TSCA was designed entirely for chemicals that would be used in products, that would be used as a component in products, and to identify any risks ahead of time. So one of the questions that comes up is, why are we where we are today if we have all these problems with PFAS in groundwater that's harming water systems around the country? And one of the issues is that EPA relies heavily upon the manufacturers to provide information about those risks. So in the course of some of the litigation that we've been involved with and that have been going on for a number of years, there's been a discovery of a number of documents within the companies that are responsible for developing the PFAS chemistry. And so, for example, the one that's up on the screen is from 3M back in 1979. With their internal fluorochemicals technical review committee, they wrote a memo about animal studies that have been shown to have that FC95, which is PFOS, is more toxic than was previously believed. Some chemical workers are exposed to this material and are known to have PFOS in their blood. So again, this is a memo, 1979, in which 3M is talking about their information and their internal knowledge that PFOS is bioaccumulating in their workers' blood, which is exactly the concern that we're dealing with today, now that this information is being more publicly studied. They go on to talk about how this information might constitute a substantial risk under the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA. And in fact, they then go on, as noted in this memo, well, maybe it's not so bad, so we won't disclose it today. Again, in 1979, 3M memo, we're talking about PFOS was administered to rhesus monkeys. They administered to 20 monkeys, and all 20 of them died. So they decided they would discontinue the study and did not report these study results to EPA. Another internal email going forward a little bit to 1988. Internal memo saying that we no longer think it's in 3M's long-term interest to perpetuate the myth that these fluorochemical surfactants are biodegradable. And as we now know, and as we've been talking about, that carbon-fluorine bond simply does not biodegrade, resulting that in that term that Margie talked about, the forever chemical. So then how is it that we got here, and how did we sort of learn about it? And unfortunately, it came about through a legal process. And the gentleman who's up on the screen, Rob Balot, is a lawyer in Cincinnati, Ohio. And Rob really was the one, was the result of a phone call he received from a farmer in Parkersburg, West Virginia, who really began to uncover some of the documents and information that we now are learning that 3M, DuPont knew about when they were developing these chemicals. And Rob, in a lawsuit really beginning in the late 1990s, was working for a farmer who lived in Parkersburg, and DuPont had a very large facility in West Parkersburg, West Virginia. And as a result of that lawsuit, Rob uncovered the documents and ultimately settled that case. But Rob then, as a result of the information that he learned through that litigation with the farmer, also understood that DuPont was discharging PFOA into the Ohio River and was discharging PFOA out at smokestacks. And as a result of that, ultimately that led to a class action lawsuit that was filed in West Virginia, and that resulted in what was called the C8 Science Panel. C8 is a term used to describe PFOA because it's an 8-chain carbon-fluorine bond. And that C8 Science Panel did about, I think it was about 7 years of study of PFOA based upon the class members that were part of that class action. So they did toxicological studies on about 70,000 participants and identified 6 health risks associated with PFOA. And that ultimately resulted in Rob working with EPA and disclosing a lot of the information, and that led to the UCMR3 evaluation that Margie was talking about in her presentation. So in 2009, EPA issued the Provisional Health Advisory, and that ultimately led to the 2016 Lifetime Health Advisory that EPA issued of 70 parts per trillion. And again, though, as Margie mentioned, this is not a regulatory standard. It is simply an advisory number, non-regulatory. So the question then becomes sort of where are we going from here from a regulatory perspective? And we have EPA's action plan. That's going to take a number of years to implement. The question is whether they will issue more health advisories on other contaminants, whether or not more maximum contaminant levels will be identified, whether EPA will issue an MCL, what PFAS compounds will be covered by MCLs. We know of about some 4,500 PFAS compounds or their precursors, so there's plenty of room for growth on regulations. And the issue will also become what concentration. We're seeing a decreasing concentration number in regulations around the country as states are exploring these contaminants. So currently, because EPA is not taking the lead, the states have had to take the lead in terms of developing regulatory standards. And not all states are doing it yet, but a number of them are, including New Jersey, which has been very aggressive. New Hampshire, New York have all been aggressive, and that has led to sort of a very patchwork approach towards PFAS regulation. The numbers are not all the same, and that's led to confusion within the public. And when the public identifies PFAS within their drinking water, they ask a lot of questions. So water systems need to be prepared to understand what the regulatory patchwork is and why it is their own state is or is not regulating PFAS and at what levels. But most water systems should be developing sort of a strategy for how to answer questions from the public, even if you're not currently detecting it, because as Margie said, it is a contaminant that is incredibly widespread and is seen basically as you test for it, you start to find it. And we can see that in this map here, which is just sort of identification of locations of where PFAS has been detected. Not really relative to any particular concentration, but just detects. And the one thing you can see from this map is in those states which are sampling for it, which are either regulating it or are thinking about regulating PFAS, they're going out, they're looking for it, and they're finding it, which is represented by all the the pins that you see in the map. But if you go to states that are not regulating it, such as New Mexico, they're not actively looking for it. You just simply don't see it because they're not looking for it. And I suspect if they were to begin regulating it, to begin mandating sampling, you're going to start seeing a whole lot more pins on these maps. So that then leads us to, what do you do now? What do you do once you've identified it and you've consulted with the engineers like Margie, who are explaining you now have to put on treatment systems. Those treatment systems are going to cost a great deal of money. One option is always pass it on to ratepayers, pass on those costs to the taxpayers. But then you get to the question of, is that fair, and are there alternatives where the taxpayer and the ratepayer should not be paying it or may not have to pay for it? So that's where I want to turn to now in my presentation in terms of where we are with some potential legal remedies for these costs. And what I want to talk about is products liability idea. And in products liability, what we traditionally think about is a product that has a mechanical defect, an electronic defect, or something that is not what the manufacturer had intended the product to do. And as a result, as shown on the screen, the product catches fire, your house catches fire, and you want to have the manufacturer of that computer responsible for the house that their product caused to burn down. And what we look to is whether or not a product liability theory can apply to the products that we're talking about here today. Anything that contains PFAS and the manufacturers of that PFAS chemistry, which gets us to a question of, what is a product liability and what does that mean? And generally, and this is very state specific, but in very general terms, a defect means a product that did not perform the way the consumer expected, or the risks of the design outweigh the benefits of that design. And that's really what we're talking about here is whether or not the product performed in the way that the consumer expected, and what were those benefits versus the risks associated with it. And then we also go to, well, why is this? Why does products liability shift some of these costs back to the manufacturer, where the manufacturer very well may not have been involved in the final use of that product? And the courts have described it as is up on the screen, which is really looking to whether or not the injury was caused in a way that was foreseeable, was the product being used in a way that was foreseeable. And in my computer example, you're working at a table, the computer is simply being used as a computer and it catches fire and burns your house down. That is being used in a way that is entirely foreseeable. And as a result, that manufacturer may be liable for the damage to the house. So what I want to talk about is how it could be used in a product that is extremely common and is a significant source of PFAS contamination in the environment, which is AFFF, the aqueous film forming foam that is used by firefighters to put out liquid fires, the gasoline fires. And one of the aspects of firefighting foam is that when used as intended, it is being sprayed directly on the ground and is being discharged directly into the environment. So looking back at sort of what are the criteria for a product liability claim and how does that apply to AFFF, the firefighting foam, the product is causes harm when it's being used as intended. And what we also see with firefighting foam is that its use is most frequently associated with training. You do see it in fires, obviously, and anytime there's a liquid fire, a gasoline fire, you may very well see it. So you have contamination from the use of firefighting foam when it's being used in the manner in which it was intended, either to put out an actual fire or for firefighting training. Both of those are known and intended use of the product. Then you get to whether or not the harm is caused by the defect. Here we're talking about the defect being the PFAS chemical itself, that it is when that product is being used as intended, meaning the foam is being sprayed on the ground, those firefighters were not intending to be releasing a hazardous compound into the environment that would also ultimately be costing millions and millions of dollars for treatment and other remedies to prevent it from getting into drinking water sources. And then the risk of the harm is outweighed by the benefits. And it's clear firefighting foam does in fact put out gasoline fires, or is very effective in that. But the question is, what are the alternatives to firefighting foam with those long chain PFAS compounds? And what we're learning is that as this information is becoming more publicly known and the health risks are becoming more publicly known, the manufacturers are actively working towards coming up with alternatives that have lower risks, but still put out the fires and still are useful for firefighting training. So why is that fair? We have, as we saw earlier, manufacturers are in the best position to know and reduce the risks associated with their products. And we saw that with those 3M memos, where in the 1970s, 1979, they were talking about their own internal descriptions of how they became aware that PFAS was bioaccumulative, had toxic impacts. You had the 20 rhesus monkeys who all died. And you had the failure to disclose to the EPA. And as a result of that, the public, those folks who are drinking water, the cities, the municipalities, the towns, the water systems, have absolutely none of this knowledge. And they don't have the capacity to obtain that knowledge unless the manufacturers are disclosing it appropriately. It also helps to incentivize manufacturers to investigate risks. And at the end of the day, they're the ones who are profiting from this. The municipalities and water systems are not, the public is not. So the courts have identified this as a fair way of shifting those costs over to the manufacturers. And as one court describes it, the burden from those dangerous products should be placed upon those who profit from the production, and that burden should not be imposed exclusively on the innocent victim, meaning that the ratepayers, the taxpayers, should not be the only ones bearing the burden of this contamination and this very widespread contamination. So the question is, does this work, and have we seen it before in other products? And the reality is, the answer is yes. And we've been doing this now for a number of years. And we've seen it with gasoline, when MTBE was added to gasoline as an oxygenate to comply with the Clean Air Act. And MTBE had similar characteristics in that it was very difficult to break down in the environment. It traveled further in groundwater, so you'd get these very large MTBE plumes. And it was added to gasoline by the manufacturers of the gasoline to comply with the law. And we filed suits against not only Exxon, but the other manufacturers of MTBE gasoline. We did it for a number of municipalities, for the city of New York, for cities around the country, the state of New Hampshire. And courts ultimately found those companies were responsible under the product's liability theory for the product, which was MTBE gasoline, and the damage that it caused to the groundwater and to drinking water supplies. Similarly, with 1,2,3-TCP trichloropropane, which is in a nematicide that was applied through agricultural lands in California, and is regulated in California, is also regulated in New Jersey. And it is found within this nematicide, which is a microscopic worm in the soil of in California. As to the nematicide itself, 1,2,3-TCP has no value. It does not function as part of the pesticide use. It is simply a byproduct within the manufacturing process. So courts are finding that, and juries are finding that 1,2,3-TCP in the nematicide product is in fact a defect, and the manufacturers of those products are being held responsible for the groundwater contamination. Similarly, farmers are applying the product to the ground, similar to the way firefighting foam is applied to the ground, and that results in direct contamination of soil and groundwater. So we're seeing that same theory that we're applying now with the PFAS products. We've seen it with other products that have damaged the environment, caused water systems to incur millions of dollars in treatment costs, and are obtaining some relief through the legal process. So we're looking now similar to those two cases that I described, and there's been other types of product contaminant cases where courts have found that product liability theory applies. We're now applying that simply to the PFAS environment now too. Not only for firefighting foam, but we're also looking to the manufacturers of the chemistry itself, primarily meaning 3M and DuPont, who either made products or supplied the chemistry to other manufacturers. And as a result of the development of that chemistry, that product, that is resulting in the releases to the groundwater and ultimately contaminating drinking water supplies. So what we seek to recover in our cases are exactly what Margie was talking about: the design, construction, operation of treatment, the extension of services to impacted private wells, the replacement waters when a municipality has to look to another municipality to do an intertie into their water system. And for states, we look for natural resource damage claims also, a very broad, wide-scale type of damage claim where groundwater is being contaminated on a very wide-scale system. So time, though, is an important aspect with PFAS. There's an increasing public awareness of PFAS. The public is looking at water sample results that municipalities are issuing, and if they see PFAS, they raise questions. That is about to become a significantly heightened public awareness because, as I mentioned earlier, Rob Balot, the lawyer who represented the farmer and ultimately brought the class action lawsuit in West Parkersburg, you're going to find that come the end of November, there's a movie called Dark Waters that's coming out about his story and the farmer that approached him, and ultimately the development of the information he obtained through the litigation against DuPont. Mark Rufio is going to be playing Rob, so it's going to get a significant amount of attention come the end of November, and that is going to cause public awareness to skyrocket, I'm afraid. And you're going to see a lot more questions coming from the public, I think, in terms of what are water systems locally doing and and has our water been tested. So I think water systems need to be prepared for that and start developing information to their users about what is happening in their own water system relative to PFAS. And for the same reason, there'll be a negative perception if there's a delayed reaction. The health risks are continuing to be explored, and they're becoming better understood. And there may also be in what's called in the legal world a statute of limitations, which says essentially in very broad terms that looking back to the date that you became aware of the contamination and its sources, you have a time limit before you can, by which you have to bring an action, or you'd be forever barred from bringing that action. And that's very state specific also, but it's something to be aware of as the information is obtained about PFAS contamination. You don't want to wait too long, otherwise you may run out of time to seek these legal remedies. So overall, in terms of where we are through this webinar, why is PFAS a problem? It is a fluorinated product that does not degrade when released into the environment. It bioaccumulates, and it has links to human health impacts and diseases. The scope of the problem was discovered really initially from a public perspective, at least, through the private litigation with DuPont. We know now that some of the manufacturers had longer knowledge going way back, but that became public knowledge through the legal process. And it's currently being regulated primarily through state action. EPA has not been taking a leadership role in PFAS regulation. And as a result, notwithstanding what EPA may do in the future, I think the states have become so invested in this process that EPA will be left behind, and this will continue to be driven by state regulation and not the Environmental Protection Agency. And litigation may be a mechanism by which water systems, municipalities may be able to recover some of the costs that Margie was talking about. It's not going to happen with every time PFAS is discovered in water systems, but my recommendation is that this option and the whether or not there is a viable legal option should be evaluated anytime a water system is talking about installing treatment for PFAS or is looking to alternative water supplies and is incurring costs as a result of PFAS contamination. It should at least be incorporated into the analysis that a water system is going through on paying for those costs that will be incurred. And with that, I think we're going to turn it over to questions. But thank you very much for your time and attention today.
Thank you to both Richard and Margie for their excellent presentations on PFAS regulations. We will now move on to the question and answer portion of the webinar. Our first question is for Margie. Is there a risk of releasing PFAS into the air when activated carbon is incinerated?
That is a good question. I was talking with Calgon Carbon actually recently about this. They believe that they are, as long as you have the afterburner process that is treating the off-gassing from the incineration, that they are destroying PFAS compounds, but my understanding is they are doing studies now to make sure that they have they can have confirming protocols in place to be able to verify that that destruction is occurring. But currently it's believed that if the incineration process or even the reactivation in the case of carbon is done properly, and you have that afterburner treatment of the gassing, that the release to the air is mitigated.
Thanks, Margie. Our next question is for Richard. What will the statute of limitations be for the PFAS contaminants?
So the answer to that is very state specific. Statutes of limitations are typically 3 years from the date of discovery. That has a number of nuances. In many states, simply testing for PFAS and learning there is some PFAS may not be enough to begin triggering the statute of limitations. And it may very well depend on what reaction is taken in response to the discovery of PFAS. So if a well is shut down, that may be enough to begin triggering the trigger of the statute of limitations. As a very rough rule of thumb, it's 3 years, but that is very dependent upon individual state laws. So we would have to do an analysis of the particular situation before you can put a defined date on the statute of limitations.
Thanks, Richard. Our next question is for Margie. Can utilities use advanced oxidation processes to treat for PFAS?
Advanced oxidation processes are not particularly effective against PFAS, no.
Thank you. Our next question is for Richard. From a legal perspective, is there any regulation that prevents companies from profiting from the sale of ion exchange resins that may be used to mitigate the PFAS problems that they're being sued for?
No, there shouldn't be. So if I understand the question, it would be whether or not the manufacturers of the resins have any liability. So one question that comes up is in the disposal and the incineration question that was raised. If there's ultimately a disposal of a treatment resin of whatever the treatment technology is that's applied to a water system, if it's put into a landfill, does that create subsequent liability associated with that disposal activity? And the reality is, and unfortunately, it very well could. That's an issue that would have to be addressed down the road, but one of the areas in which EPA is exploring regulation is whether or not it will call some of these PFAS compounds, and primarily they're looking at PFOS and PFOA, as to whether they will deem those to be hazardous substances or hazardous waste. And ultimately, as we've seen with Superfund over the last 30 years or more, those who dispose of hazardous waste into landfills can ultimately become liable for subsequent groundwater contamination associated with those wastes in landfills. We're seeing obviously fewer situations of unlined landfills. These would typically go into lined landfills, but PFAS, because of its nature, is ending up in the liquid that's captured in the treatment systems within landfills, and ultimately, what happens to that becomes even a subsequent waste stream. So PFAS, because of its persistence and because it does not get treated through ordinary treatment systems, is a very complicated product relative to legal liability. Ultimately, if incineration is an effective mechanism for total destruction, and I think there needs to be some more testing on that and evaluation, that may be the best avenue for ultimate disposal of PFAS waste. But you also see it with biosolids. You see, and if surface water regulations come into effect, you'll see it with a wastewater stream in any wastewater treatment facility that discharges into a surface water body. Those ordinary wastewater treatments do not destroy PFAS. So there's a very complicated analysis that has to go on with PFAS anytime you're dealing with it. And similar treatment technologies may be applied to wastewater streams down the road.
Thanks, Richard. Our next question is for Margie. Is adsorption the only effective method of PFAS removal when using GAC? What about biofiltration where GAC is biologically active?
Biological filtration, again, is not very effective at PFAS removal. Adsorption is the mechanism by which the PFAS compounds would be removed from GAC. I mean, removed by GAC.
Question is for Richard. Can you speak a bit to some concerns that regulations may be getting too far in front of the science?
You know, we see this, so this is a similar pattern with emergent contaminants. We've seen it with 1,4-dioxane, we've seen it with MTBE, where the concerns about risks and the demands to regulators that they take action, sometime, as is suggested in the question, are in front of the actual science. What we do have with PFAS compounds is that C8 panel that I described with Rob Bilot's class action litigation in West Parkersburg, West Virginia. And one of the things that happened, and this was very specific to PFOA, but one of the things that happened in that litigation was, as I described in the presentation, a multi-year evaluation of a very large human population. So again, about 70,000 participated in that study, which is an unusually large population. They were talking about a number of different concentrations of PFAS or PFOA. So one of the things we have probably a better handle on with PFAS than we did with 1,4-dioxane or MTBE is one very detailed study regarding PFOA and the identification of 6 health hazards associated with PFOA, and they excluded a number of others. So that was a panel that was put together both by the class members and their lawyers, but also DuPont was involved in the selection of those experts. So we do have that relative to whether or not the regulations are getting ahead of the science on PFAS. But we also, and it's a legitimate concern where we're talking about very low concentrations at regulations, in some cases in the single-digit parts per trillion, and we are still developing the science. And that is a common issue with emergent contaminants, and the state regulators that are involved in the MCL process or groundwater standards, or developing the groundwater standards, are really looking to public health protection as their first priority, and then as the science develops around that, they presumably will start to see adjustments in those MCLs. And I suspect over time we will start to see a more uniform state-by-state MCL, as opposed to where we are today, which is really some significant variations between MCLs or regulations generally, relatively few actual MCLs. So yes, I agree that it's an issue, but for a water system that's trying to address and deal with it, sort of the legal regulatory compliance is their number one priority, and that regulatory compliance obligation is what we look to trigger the liability of the manufacturers.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks again to our panel for their great presentations on PFAS regulations. If we did not get to your question during the Q&A, our presenters will be sure to follow up with you after the webinar. This concludes our webinar on Shifting PFAS Treatment Costs, Make Polluters Pay. But before we go, I want to thank you for joining the webinar today. Don't forget to participate in the survey immediately following the webinar. We look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Until next time, thank you for keeping the water safe and secure.